Okay, that's the recording and the transcript started. The usual caveats apply. You're welcome to come on and chat. If you don't want to be recorded, then simply don't open your mic or your video. You can, however, ask questions in the chat. They're not recorded. It won't be publicly available. So you're still welcome to do that. Okay, so we had started last week talking about risk. Excuse me. And we had started with the idea, we'd started talking about risk management. So we'd started thinking about all the places that there were risk and what sort of analyses we might want to do for those. So we're going to continue in the same vein today. At least we will once I turn off my phone. Everything seems to be working today except Teams. So we started talking about risk analysis last week, and I want to start talking about types of risk this week and the sorts of things that might go into your risk register. So just to recap, we had already said last week that everyone takes risks. It's not something that you can get away from. You can't be alive and not take risks. And sometimes that's a positive thing. Sometimes you have to take a risk to actually progress. Organizations are no different in that effect. Organizations take risks as well. The important thing is not doing so blindly. In other words, you should think about the risks. You should think about the risks you're taking, the risks that you want to avoid. In other words, you should identify every possible risk for your organization. And it's important in your head to get away from what you've been thinking about or what you've possibly been thinking about in terms of risk. And I've probably fed into that with some of my lectures. I've been talking about road traffic accidents or falling off ladders. Well, that's part of risk, but it's not all of risk. Particularly for an organization isn't going to fall off a ladder. But an organization might have cash flow issues that stop it paying its employees. It might see legislative issues that affect its business. It might see a skills gap between the type of skills it needs for its organization and the kind of people that are available to fill those posts. It just depends. It depends on the business, it depends on what they're doing, and it depends on the current circumstances, which is why a risk register isn't a static document. And you've seen that with some of the things that I showed you before. You've seen it has dates on them. You've seen that risk registers have progress made towards managing risks. So it's a living document, something that is created but is then updated and looked at and worked with. It's not simply a one and done type thing. So we need to make sure that our risks in our organisation are identified, and once they're identified, we can then manage them. So we want to identify threats, things that would make it difficult for us in our business. Now, threats come in all sorts of shapes, sizes, and levels. It may be a threat to your business if your lease is going to expire on your office. But the level of that threat will depend on when that lease is going to expire. If you know that the lease is going to expire in 2 years, it gives you 2 years to think about it, work on it. So the threat level is actually low. It is still a risk. You might not get new premises, you might not be able to renegotiate a new lease, whatever it happens to be. But given the timescales involved, if it's 2 years away, the risk level is low. If you know that your lease is going to expire in 3 months, that risk level rises quite substantially. And if your lease is going to expire next week, your risk level goes through the roof. Pun very much intended. So we have to identify the threat, but also try to understand what it means to the business. How critical is it? What will it actually do if it comes to fruition? And then what we want to do is try to make sure that that doesn't happen. We try to figure out ways to reduce the risk. I said this last week. We talked about road traffic accidents last week. We know that there's a risk. We can't stop there being a risk. People are going to cross the road. But we can think about ways that we can approach this risk. We can avoid it. Don't cross the road. Or we can educate people to cross the road more safely. We can do the same sort of thing, take the same sorts of approaches with organisations. Now, again, and I know that I've said this before in a different context, there are different ways to approach risk. So I've come up with five different approaches, which are fairly standard. You wouldn't not do these. But depending on the business that you're in, depending on what you do, there may be other approaches that you want to take. That's entirely down to your organisation and its particular business, its particular threats, its particular issues. So, can anyone think? So there's five there: strategic, compliance, operational, financial, and reputational. Are there any other ones you think might be important? So there's a poll coming up on your screen just now. You can just type in a word or two if there's anything that comes to you. But any other approaches that you think might be helpful in this case, either from your own organisation or just something you might think about for any organisation. First one that's popping up is safety, and I would absolutely agree that safety is an issue. But of course, safety is also a compliance risk. It's a subset of compliance because you're complying with the health and safety at work regulations. Ethics is also an issue. Again, I would contend that that possibly comes under reputational risk. We don't have to look far to see people who have breached ethical codes so much that their reputation has been completely trashed. Someone's saying security. I'm not sure. So we're talking security risk. That, I think, comes under strategic risk. If your strategy doesn't include ways to ensure that your security is never breached, whether that's physical security by people coming in the door that's not supposed to, or as you cybersecurity guys will greatly identify, IT security so that people can't virtually come through your door. It is an issue, but I think it comes under strategic issues. So I'll leave that open for a while. If anything comes to you, please feel free to add it in. But you can see the issue that we have. You're on the right lines, and you're certainly thinking about the right things. But I'm simply contending that it comes under these general headings. And I'll show you what I mean. I'll go through some of them, and we can talk in more detail about what they might mean. So the first one there is strategic risk. If you're in an organization and you're not making a plan, you're doing it wrong. A couple of weeks ago, we spent some time looking at a plan for a local authority, what they intend to do, what their goals were for the next 5 years, I think it was. Of course, the one thing that we know about a plan is they are susceptible to not succeeding. Doesn't mean you shouldn't make them, but it means that things change. Things can happen that mean that what you wanted to do isn't going to happen. You make a strategic plan in 2013, and that strategic plan is to double your business in 10 years by exploiting the single market into the EU. You devote resources to that in your organization. You start to try to understand the markets in other countries. You spend ages getting it set up. You take 3 years doing that, and then in 2016, the whole market disappears because of a political decision. So external changes can very much impact your plans, as can internal changes. You might be reliant on certain people to do certain tasks. And one of your, excuse me, quite often one of your risk register items will be about staff. Are there any particular staff whose skills can't be replicated? Some people cruelly call it what happens if Fred falls under a bus line. In other words, what happens to your organization if somebody doesn't turn up? What happens to this lecture if I fall under a bus? Is there anyone else that can take over this module? Is there anyone else that has that knowledge and can present this stuff? If not, that's a risk to the organization. Excuse me. No matter what happens, the important point is that you have to adapt, because nothing ever stays the same. That's about the one certainty. So there can be lots of different ways that things can change. Internally, people can leave. You might not adapt properly. You might not think about particular items which just fall through the cracks and then change. External stuff might change. So you get to the point where political responses or legislative responses or any other type might affect your business. It's up to you to try and predict those. For lots of people, of course, what they try and do instead is affect those decisions, which is why you quite often see scandals where lobbyists attempt to affect the legislation that's coming through. In other words, they want the legislation to be favourable to their organisation, and they'll spend money to do that. If you think businesses give money to political parties simply because they want to be altruistic, then you might want to think again. So there are all sorts of things that can affect you, both internal and external. Let's just look at one of them. So there's a poll come up again, asking the very simple question, what's that? Anybody know what that is? A projector is a suggestion. Camera, also a suggestion. Why does a projector, an old projector? I mean, it's a reasonable guess, but I suppose the question would be, why does it need all those circuit boards underneath it? And does anyone know what that is taped onto the side of it? A server, someone thinks? A video recorder? Again, if you know what the thing is taped to the side of it, that says digital on it, feel free to put that in as well. Someone says it's a camera. Someone says it's an old PC. And someone has identified the bit taped to the side as being a cassette. And for those youngsters here, a cassette was a way, most usually, for storing music. So you might have a tape player in your car to listen to music as you went along, but also you could use it to store data. And if any of you have heard the sounds, excuse me, that an old modem would make when you connect, and you can actually hear the data getting sent, well, these cassette tapes would work in the same way. They would convert the data to sound, store it onto the tape, and then play it back, and you'd get data again. And a lot of the old home PCs, home computers like Spectrums and things would use that. Okay, some of you are on the right lines. So I can tell you that that is the very first digital camera. Whoever said camera, well done. You correctly identified a lens. So the big lens is to take the picture, the wee lens is to focus it. Clearly there's a lot of circuit boards underneath, the idea being to take whatever you see via that lens and convert it to data, which can then be stored on that cassette tape taped onto the side. This is from 1975. Very first digital camera was invented in 1975, and it was invented by a company called Kodak. And Kodak were a very old, very established company. They had, whoops, they had been around for the best part of a century. They sold cameras, but more importantly, they sold film, and they sold chemicals to develop the film, and they sold paper to put the photos onto, and they sold even more chemicals to develop the paper. And they had a whole set of shops and factories and developing places where if you took a picture on your camera, you would take out the film and take it into a shop or pop it in the post, send it away, and they would develop it, print the pictures for you, and you would get them back. Not surprisingly, they made lots and lots of money for that, because they would sell the paper, and they would sell the film, and they would sell the chemicals. Admittedly, they sold the cameras as well, but they didn't actually particularly care about the cameras, other than to make sure that people bought them so that they'd buy the papers and the chemicals and the film. And they were a multi-billion-dollar company, and they employed lots of smart people, and one of those smart people invented this digital camera. And the management went, wow, that's really impressive, well done. Now go away. Why do you think they said, now go away? I'm hoping to see stuff in the chat. Cost too much. It was a risk. What kind of risk? Digitals and the need for chemicals or paper or everything else they sold. Yeah, absolutely. However, what would be the bigger risk? And as it turned out, what was the bigger risk? The bigger risk, of course, is that they don't do it because the whole market moved towards digital. As you rightly identify, they didn't want to stop selling all the stuff that they sold. So they just wanted the market to continue. But the market wasn't interested in listening to what Kodak wanted. They understood about digital cameras. They understood that they could be connected to computers and you could do all sorts of things on computers. So they were going to change anyway, no matter what Kodak wanted. Sadly, Kodak filed for bankruptcy in 2012, 37 years after they invented the digital camera and didn't exploit it. And of course, the picture was taken by a Nikon, a company that also made cameras, but weren't so shy about moving to a new medium. So strategic risks can come from all sorts of places. Things that you do or things that you don't do. No one ever said this stuff was easy. Okay, the next one that I've identified is a compliance risk. Be a shock if a course on governance, risk and compliance didn't talk about compliance risks. And of course, all organisations have to conform to current legislation. However, new legislation doesn't usually just appear in a puff of smoke. There's usually some sort of consultation period. There's some sort of lead-up period. You have an idea of how things are going to happen. And that allows you to plan. That's why the stuff at the moment, and I don't know if you've been keeping up, there's a whole pile of legislation that was incorporated into UK law from European law. The government are currently saying that on a certain day, they'll click a switch and all of that legislation will just go. So what do you do if you're an organisation? What do you do to plan for 4,000 laws appearing like that? Will they just go? Will they be replaced? Will it be different legislation? And of course, no one knows. Hard to plan something when the terms for that change have never actually been been defined. So how do they know if they're going to be compliant next month or next year? And of course, that's just part of it. What if you change? What if the company that I suggested was expanding into Europe decided, okay, well, I'm going to expand into the US instead? Do you know what the legislation is in the US? Actually, is the legislation in the US all the same? Or do different states have different approaches? What about the other way? Again, you may have seen stuff in the media about the US agricultural imports. The US have issues with certain third-party bodies attaching themselves to chickens, so they wash them in chlorine to get rid of them. Chlorine. What you having for your Sunday breakfast, your Sunday dinner? Roast chicken and chlorine. So there are differences in legislation between different countries, different parts of the country. There was some hysterical nonsense today about what seems fairly standard legislation in Scotland to say that we're going to recycle glass and plastic. And you've got the UK government saying, oh, you can't recycle glass. How dare you? Seems to me fairly uncontroversial that we want to recycle things, but other legislative bodies seem to disagree. So who wins? Recycling is very clearly in the competence of the Scottish Parliament. But the Scottish Parliament itself only exists because Westminster allows it to exist. So can Westminster just override what the Scottish Parliament does? Who wins? And how do you then account for all this stuff that you've done? How do you then report it? If you sell into another country or another country sells here, do you have to report those sales? Do you have to tot them up and have a different legal entity that pays its taxes in different countries? What are the accounting rules that work for that? What if you're doing stuff online? What do you do with all the data that you get in? What do you do with all the customer data? Are you GDPR compliant? Are we still doing GDPR? That was brought in by Europe, but it was mirrored in the UK. Is GDPR staying? Is it going? You've got a whole bunch of organisations jumping up and down, not knowing. And of course, the approach will change. If GDPR stays, then the businesses go, phew, don't need to do anything. But what if it goes? Or what if a different set of legislation comes in instead? Well, if you operate in the UK, you'll have to comply with that legislation. But the one thing that we know about online businesses is they're not particularly geographically limited. So if you want people in the EU to also be able to see your site, do you now have to comply with GDPR for EU territories and some new legislation for UK territories? It becomes a complete mess, and that becomes a big problem. And even the biggest organizations can have problems that way. 4 years ago, a massive organization was found to be non-compliant. They put in a new system. You phoned this organization, and you've all heard those voice prompts. You know, say one if you want to go to accounts, say two if you want to go to sales, that kind of thing. Or say a few words that tell us what you want to do. So what this organisation said was, oh, hang on, well, if people are talking to us, we can listen to their voice, we can make some digital representation of that and have a biometric ID that's linked to the voice. And if the same person phones us up, we can look that up and then immediately know their account, and it'll speed things up, which sounded great. What they didn't do was ask anybody that phoned them up whether or not they were okay with that. Turns out that's against the law. It's against GDPR, as you'll know because you've been looking at the GDPR laws, which I won't be covering, but you're expected to be familiar with and are in your student materials. The Information Commissioner's Office forced them to stop doing this. It forced them to stop recording these things and using biometric IDs. And as you've no doubt read ahead already on the slide, the organisation that did that was Her Majesty's Customs and Revenue. The tax man didn't understand the legislation of the country that they tax. So if they're struggling, what chance does a two-person startup have? These things can be a problem. They're a problem enough when the legislation is understood. It can get to be a bigger problem staying compliant when legislation changes. So organisations need to be on top of that. Anybody get any questions about that? Okay, so we're halfway through the time. If no one's got any questions and no one has any objections, I think what we will do is take a break there. Give me a thumbs up if you're happy to take a break. Okay, Rachel says we should take a break, and I trust Rachel. Okay, we'll take 10 minutes and I'll see you back here in 10. It's amazing how long it takes to make a cup of tea, isn't it? There are questions about the submission in the chat. I'll do them at the end because it's not specifically about this stuff. Okay, so if I forget, just prod me again. Excuse me. And I'll answer those once we've done with the risk stuff. So has anybody got any questions about stuff that we did before the break, before we continue on? No. Okay, in that case, let's move on. So we've had a couple of the headings. The next one, the next category is operational risk. Stuff that happens as part of you being an organization, being a business, doing your normal day-to-day things. Are there any things that you're doing in there that could be a problem? I think I've probably mentioned this example before, but I dealt with an organization who had fairly lax procedures for updating accounts. And one day someone phoned them up and said, "Hello, I am Flintstone Corporation and I've changed my bank details. Could you pay any invoices straight into this bank account with this sort code and this account number?" And somebody sitting in the accounts office went, "Yeah, no problem. Let me just make a note of that and update the system." 3 months later, the actual Flintstone company phoned up and said, "We're getting a bit concerned because you haven't been paying any invoices for 3 months." So that was when they figured out that the person that had phoned up was a bogus call and that they had been paying lots and lots of money to scammers who immediately transferred it offshore and they lost every penny. And of course, they all still had to pay their original invoices. Things like that can have quite a deleterious effect on an organization, as you can imagine. And they can happen on a large scale. So that was well into six figures for that one. Or there can be smaller ones. And the example on the slide there is, what do you do to make sure that accounts are paid properly? How easy would it be for someone to send a payment for 10,000 instead of 1,000? You can imagine how easy it would be just to hit another zero, even if it's just by accident. But what if it's by design? What if someone says, "Oh, how about I send you extra money? You'll get 9,000 more and we'll split it between us, 4.5 each." What's stopping an employee doing that? What in your operations manual stops that? Are there two people that have to sign off payments? And if so, what level does that have to get to before that happens? We talked a wee bit about that before. So again, in previous places, I've been in the situation where people have delegated authority. They can spend up to a certain amount. But if they go above that amount, they have to get pre-approval. So I would get in an email saying, "We want to spend £250,000 on this. Here's why. Can you sign this off, please?" And I would have to sign off and say, "Yeah, okay, we can do that." But what if there's no procedure in place to do that? What if you just say to somebody, "Yeah, on you go, spend the money. Where are the checks and balances?" So these issues can be a problem anywhere. Accounts, finance, HR. What if somebody leaves the company? What are HR doing to make sure that they don't continue to get paid or continue to get access to the building or continue to get access to the systems? And speaking of systems, what are IT doing about servers? What if they go down totally? What if there's just a power cut? What happens to your systems then? You need to understand these risks and have plans in place. So I've given a couple of examples for the previous headings, and I'm not even going to attempt to give an example because it's every company that you can think of. Every company has operational difficulties. The only question is whether they make the media or not. So if you're somebody like Google or Facebook, then yes, they make the media. I think it was just last week or the week before that Microsoft had Teams and Outlook and all their other services all gone down for quite a while. There barely seems to be a day going past when Twitter don't have outages. Can't imagine why that happens. So these things happen. The best we can do is plan for them and understand what we're doing to recover from them as soon as we can. Again, I'm not seeing anything in the chat. If you have questions, don't hesitate to come in and ask. So if I don't see anything, I'll just continue on. Next main heading is finances. Every organisation needs money to continue. If you don't have money, how are you going to pay for your office or your phone line or your computer or your staff? The cash in and cash out to an organisation is called its turnover. And you might have a short-term deficit. If you manufacture Christmas trees, you're not going to be making much money January through to October. But you'll make it up in November and December. What you need to do is flatten that out to make sure that you can continue to be a company for those 10 months when you don't make any money. So you get peaks and troughs in your cash flow. What you want to make sure is that that doesn't destabilize the company, which can happen if the deficit is too large and you just can't recover. Again, sadly, you may have seen stuff in the news this week about a large retailer, M&Co, I think it is. They've closed all their shops and staff are now out of work. They just didn't have enough money to keep going because not enough people were buying their things. So it can be about difficult retail environment. Currently, at the moment, people don't have any money, so the last thing they're doing is spending it if they don't have to, which means that retail is totally struggling just now. Part of the reason people don't have much money is that things have gone up. Things like mortgages. Why have mortgages gone up? Because interest rates have gone up. Why did interest rates go up? Because of political decisions taken. All of a sudden, after decades of stable interest rates, they've shot up and people's mortgages and rents are all zooming up, which make it difficult for them to find money for other things, like the clothes out of M&Co. If you're trading over multiple companies, the exchange rate can cause the same sort of issue. Is the pound worth more or less than $1? What will that do to your income? What if you sell something and somebody doesn't pay you? Or what if you sell somebody does pay you, but it takes them 3 months? What's that going to do to your cash flow? You've already paid for the materials to make something, you've paid for the time, you've paid for the premises, and now you're not getting paid for it. Or what if people stop buying from you altogether? What if the stuff that you've been making is suddenly not wanted? And tech firms are particularly bad for that. Some of you may remember search engines like Ask Jeeves or Alta Vista, or even Yahoo. You're still around and still have search, but barely used. People just went elsewhere. And that can happen almost overnight. And sometimes it can happen for the best of reasons, because you've been trying to grow your business. So here's the example for the financial one. It's a company called Pennies a few years ago in Dumfries and Galloway, and what they did was they processed seafood. So they would get the stuff in from the boats and they would process it, make it available in packs and send it out. And they had a contract. They had a contract with Marks and Spencer's to provide Marks and Spencer's with all their seafood, which is great. In fact, they didn't start off like that. They started off with lots of customers, but Marks and Spencer's bought so much and so much and so much more and so much more that eventually their whole factory was dedicated to servicing the Marks and Spencer's contract. Well, what happens if you don't have that contract anymore? In this particular case, Pennies had a problem. Their source materials, in this case seafood, went up. It went up 25%. I know you can't imagine food going up by ridiculous amounts. How can that ever happen? What is it, 16.7% this year? The raw materials went up 25%. Okay, Andrew, catch up in the video later. Raw materials went up 25%. If Pennies continued with the contract, they would actually be making a loss on the contract. So they went back to M&S and said, look, we're going to have to increase our prices. And M&S went, increase them if you want. We're not paying them. We've got a contract and we're going to pay you what we said we would pay you. Result, they stopped. They said, we can't do the contract. We can't make a loss on this. And 577 people were made redundant because they couldn't make the finances work. James is quibbling with my 16.7%, and he's quite right. He's saying in reality, most food has doubled because it depends what you buy. Bread, milk, eggs, pasta, doubled and more in the last year. But some other things haven't gone up so much, so it averages out at 16.7%. But averages can hide an awful lot, as you quite rightly point out. The final one is reputational risk. What if you have an organisation that's doing things that people don't agree with, or makes a decision that people aren't happy with? It's only been a couple of years since Facebook and Twitter removed Donald Trump from their platforms after he tried to overthrow his own government. 2 years later, and they're allowing him back. Now, you can debate whether he should be coming back or not. But however you come down on that question, there is still reputational risk. When he was banned, there was reputational risk to the people that support him. Before he was banned, there was reputational risk from the people that asked why he hadn't been banned earlier. Now that he's been reintroduced to the platforms and you have Nick Clegg coming up with all sort of mealy-mouthed reasons why they're bringing him back, all to try and limit the reputational damage from people that don't think he should be back. And he's coming back not for any real reason, but simply to stop the tsunami of criticism from the people who do support him and use Facebook services. It's only a 2-hour lecture, so we don't have time to talk about all the reputational issues that Twitter has had in the last month. Seems they can't do anything without upsetting everybody. So when you have that reputational risk, it means that people are less likely to see you favourably. And if they don't see you favourably and there are choices, they can go elsewhere. And if they go elsewhere, you lose money. And if you make decisions that people don't agree with, your staff get upset. They're demoralised and don't want to work for an organisation that they don't think reflects their own values. So it can be outside the company and inside the company. And that vicious cycle will continue. Now, it could be a massive event. So it could be, there was an organisation that, I don't know, 30 or 40 years ago had an issue with their drugs. And to be fair, it wasn't their issue. Someone had gone into a chemist, tampered with their drug, and then tried to blackmail the company to say, if you don't pay me money, I'm going to tamper with more of your drugs. And the organisation responded in a really good way. They told everybody what was happening. They took all the products off their shelf. For sure, it cost them money in the short term, but in the long term, everybody was looking at it thinking, good for you. You're looking after us. You're making sure that we, the customer, will be okay. So instead of people going, oh, we're never going to buy anything from them again, what if somebody else has done something to their drugs? Everyone went, yeah, we're safe. We can always go back to them because they know that they'll put us first. There was another drug company who had an issue with one of their drugs. In this case, it wasn't an outside influence. They actually had made a mistake. They had distributed drugs and they had an issue. But in this particular case, it was a small amount of the drug. It was like one part of one production run. So there's a very few of them. And they refused to recall all the drug. Instead, they said, we'll have a look for this number. And if it's this number, we'll replace them. And they got huge blowback in that because they'd made the mistake, they'd distributed them, and then they were putting the onus onto the customer to say, look after yourselves, check these before you take them because they might be do you something quite nasty. Oddly enough, those two companies are actually the same company. They just had different management who approached these issues in a different way. And I can assure you that the first one went down far better than the second. And whereas the first one actually increased sales, the second one saw sales plummet because it wasn't just the drug that had an issue that they stopped buying, it was anything from that company because they didn't trust the company not to do them wrong. And that can happen anywhere. Reputational risk can be a problem. I don't know if you've heard this story, for example. There was a seafood processor whose costs went up, which meant that they had to charge their customers more money, but the customer refused. So the seafood supplier had to go into administration and put 577 people out of work. I don't know if you've heard of this one before. The customer, Marks and Spencer's in this case, suffered massive reputational damage. Because no matter what you think about contracts and contract law and all the rest of it, people can look at a situation that say, you want to buy something for less than it costs to make and think that's just wrong. So M&S suffered massive reputational damage from that same issue. And that's the 5 that I wanted to talk about. Are there any questions about those? Yeah. Okay. Don't see anything come up in the chat. So, not surprisingly, what I want you to do for this week is to start thinking about risks. Either for the case study for your assessment or for an organisation that you want to use, start thinking about the risks. Start categorising them. Start trying to figure out which ones are more or less important. And actually quantify that. Now, whether that's in money or time or reputation or any of these other things, I want you to start thinking about what it would cost these organisations if any of those risks came to pass. And importantly, and as you saw in some of the documents before, I want you to also think about how you would stop those risks happening. I want you to think about what mitigations you'd put in place to make sure that that didn't happen. And remember that we saw that before when we were looking at risk registers. So here's the one that we, here's the one that we looked at last week, or one of the ones that we looked at last week. And you'll remember that there are different ways of showing the risks, different ways of displaying them, different formats, different approaches. And because I know someone is going to ask me, it's entirely up to you which one you use when you're doing your report. But what I do want you to do is make sure that all of these things, the risks, how much they are, what sort of mitigations they are, I want them all to be in there. But remember, we had things like this. What the risk is, what the mitigations are, what you think that will do after it, and what you would then continue with. So you don't have to use this format or any of the other formats that we did, but you have to have some sort of format and have to have some sort of risk register. Caroline's asking about the task from last week. So last week was slightly different. We looked at the categories, which are different categories to this week. So the 2 different ones for risk were about those 2 different categories. So last week we looked at risk analysis, and you'll remember that we identified, in effect, 5 main categories, 5 different types of risk, if you like. And we looked at those categories and how we might approach them. And again, just like this week, were other approaches, but last week we looked at how we would manage risks and thought about accepting them, avoiding them, transferring them, mitigating them, or exploiting them. So that was last week's task. This week's task is about the risk register. Okay, any other questions just now? David, you haven't missed the answer. I'll do it after we stop recording because it's not so much about the material, it's more about the admin bit. Nope, all happy. I'm not seeing any questions popping up, which means that we can stop recording.